All right, hello everyone, welcome back for another one. This is World War II Part 3, and we're actually going to finish up the war in this one. We actually technically finished the combat part of the war, and now what we're going to do is focus on studying the home front during the war. So home front just means America, because it's the war at home, and World War II is it has a very, very big impact on America at home, and we're going to look at that. The first thing we're going to look at is the role of women during the war. It's going to be very similar to World War I, except that some women are actually going to enter the military during this. Women in World War I did enter the military as nurses, but we're going to see women in the military during World War II actually served as pilots. There's not a whole lot of them, but that is part of the thing, part of women's roles during World War II. So this should be a pretty quick one, should be pretty interesting, and but make sure to visit my website to download the PowerPoint, and you can email me if you need to, if you have any questions about anything about World War II. Let's rock and roll. Remember to pause as you need to, and check it out. Here we go. Women during World War II. All right. So, because men went off to join the war, and this is going to be a war that makes the military got huge during World War II. So many men joined the military. So, this is going to leave big jobs open, the big amount of jobs open for women. And women are going to enter the workplace doing pretty much every kind of job. They work in factories, they take over like firefighter jobs like we were talking about with World War I. They did have to kind of step up and do a little bit of everything. Because most men during World War II living in America did join the military in some way or another. The attack on Pearl Harbor really got people feeling patriotic, and obviously Hitler being so aggressive in Nazi Germany and in Europe really kind of scared people. So men were really fired up to protect freedom and democracy for America, okay? So notice what it says: by the end of the war, by 1945, nearly 25% of married women worked outside the home, which is pretty amazing. That's a big growth from before. Now this is actually a really good thing, because this is going to push us further into the 1950s and 60s when women, yes, during the 1950s, women tended to go back home and be part of the nuclear family as is created during the 1950s. But a lot of women are going to see this as a new opportunity and keep pushing forward and work for more women's rights, and we'll talk more about that in future lessons. But this is important. This is a social change that is continuing on. We've learned about the roles of women changing since World War I. Remember, in 1920, we got the right to vote. Women got the right to vote. And then moving forward, they wanted to go to college, and then we had flappers and things like that. So things are changing for women, and they're continuing to change. And World War II helped out with that change, the social changes that benefit women, which is very, very good. Okay, so there we go. So like I said, a lot of women, they did do pretty much every single kind of job, but the aircraft industry is what really grew with women's jobs. Notice what it says: 310,000 women worked in the U.S. aircraft industry. That's a lot of women. And from this, we get the Rosie the Riveter propaganda. And this is a very, very famous poster. If you've been around for a while, you've probably seen this poster before. But Rosie the Riveter, she's saying, "We can do it." A riveter is someone who puts in rivets, and rivets are how metal is attached to an airplane. So Rosie the Riveter comes from women working in the aircraft industry. And this is a big deal. The government wanted, we're trying to create a gigantic war machine because we're fighting two wars, basically. We're fighting in the Pacific against Japan, and we're fighting the Nazis in Europe. So we need to mobilize big time. We have to create weapons, we have to create airplanes, we have to create tanks, and we're going to talk about that here in just a little bit. And women are going to fill in these jobs because the men are not there. And this is really, really good, like I said, because it is going to lead to more social change, and it births some propaganda. All right, so there you go. Now, women in the military. Now, this is pretty cool. Some 350,000 women joined the military, okay? And the ones that you need to know about that are very interesting are called the Women Air Force Service Pilots, aka the Wasps, which is a pretty cool name for these ladies. Now, 38 women lost their lives during the war, but they're not given any type of military honors or benefits because they are women. So the government, even though they're kind of moving forward, letting women join and do these types of things, they don't really treat them right, unfortunately. And notice what it says: until 1977, the Wasps did not receive full military status. But if you look in 2010, the government went back and honored these women with the Congressional Gold Medal. Now, I know that for them back in the day, that probably didn't do much for them having it in 2010, but it's kind of the government saying we're sorry a little bit, hopefully. So the Wasps were pretty cool. They did a lot of carrying important things back and forth. Not necessarily going to serve in major combat roles, and I don't believe any of them served in any combat roles. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, make sure to email me if I'm wrong about that. But there were plane crashes and things like that, and that's how some of them died. So very interesting, very cool, and it's another step forward. Women are definitely in the military now, which is fantastic. But this is kind of the first time this has ever happened in American history, which is very interesting. So there you go, the Wasps. There they are. They got a cool patch there. Women Air Force Service Pilots, which is pretty cool. All right, so 24. What industry did women mainly work in? So that's going to be the aircraft industry. This is going to be the first war where aircraft are used on a large scale, and I'm going to put the number here, about 310,000 women. That's a lot of women. Big jobs. Big jobs for those. But anyways, this is going to be the first time, the first war where aircraft are used on a very large scale. So this is very, very important, and that's why the number is so high, all right? So let me look and make sure that that's looking straight, and you can see it, that looks great. And then who were the Wasps during World War II? Basically, I'm asking what does WASP stand for? Women's Air Force Service Pilots. There you go. So check on that. I'm going to get me some water. Pause if you need to. All right, we're going to move on. So that covers women's roles during the war. Remember, they go to work. This is a big deal because they're going to have to fill in most jobs that men leave open, and that's a big amount of work. However, the industry that women mainly take over is the aircraft industry, and then the Wasps are the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. So women in the military is pretty awesome. All right, moving on. All right, so now we're going to talk about African Americans at home. We already talked about the Tuskegee Airmen, so we did mention African Americans' roles during the war. But now we have to talk about them at home. So there's going to be more social changes, and this is also very, very good. We're going to get the Fair Employment Practices Commission and then the integration of the armed forces. Now, so we're talking about the 1940s is when World War II happens, and then if you recall from what you've learned in prior classes, the Civil Rights Movement is going to start in the 1950s and then take place mainly in the 1960s. But that begins right here, okay? So let's check this out. So because of all these factories that are now creating stuff for the war machine, aka airplanes, tanks, jeeps, basically anything you can use to fight in a war, weapons, guns, bombs, etc. The big factories in the north are going to be turned into war factories, wartime factories, and we're going to talk about that here soon. And African Americans continue to leave the south and head to the north to these big factory cities. And this becomes something that is noticeable in society and something called the WW2 campaign. And it says victory over fascism in Europe and victory over discrimination at home. So African American leaders at home look at this and they say, hey, look, over there they're fighting fascism. We are facing something called discrimination at home. And so we can use this as a double victory. We can move, we can get out of the racist South, and we can start to fight for more rights, which is very, very, very good, okay? So WW2 campaign. All right, part of this WW2 campaign that the government makes happen is called the Fair Employment Practices Commission. And what this is it says, businesses, we know that y'all are private institution, and so therefore we have to respect your rights to some degree. However, businesses, you can no longer discriminate based on race or religion. You have to hire qualified candidates, no matter the skin color. Okay, so this is a very, very big deal because before private businesses could say, hey, we're not hiring you, and they don't have to give a reason why, but it usually was because of skin color or something like that. So now this is a big, big social change, and it's also a big economic change because now African Americans are going to be able to have they're going to have access to more high-paying jobs in these good factories, and this is going to lead to social change. And also, this is the government taking a step and saying, hey, we recognize we've got to do a little bit better, okay? So it's called the Fair Employment Practices Commission, and it says, hey, you've got to give people the right to work regardless of what they look like or who they worship or whatever like that, okay? So there you go. Now, during the war, the armed forces was segregated, meaning there are black units and white units, units for African American soldiers and units for white soldiers, okay? And because of the war, there are actions like the Tuskegee Airmen, and there are actions of all black units doing heroic things during the war. And people look at this and they say, look, we're fighting against major racism, fascism, Nazism, all that stuff in Europe. At home, we're not super innocent. If we look at discrimination, if we look at the racist South, if we look at the Jim Crow laws, saying, hey, these guys are going over there and they're risking their lives for freedom, and they come home and they don't have it the same way that white people have it, okay? And it's the military. It's the most basic thing. They're fighting for that freedom. So why are we separating them, okay? So after World War II, President Truman does something that's very, very good. He desegregated, aka integrated the military, and black and white soldiers now serve alongside each other, which is very, very good, okay? That's called Integration of the Armed Forces, happened in 1948. All right, so here we go. So what is the purpose of the WW campaign? This is social advancement for African Americans at home. Say what it means. Victory over fascism and discrimination. So that's where you get the WB. And I'm sorry, I've run out of space. There you go. That says discrimination. Discrimination. Hard to see. Sorry, I got sideways there. What are 2 steps taken in America towards equality for African Americans during/after the war? That would be the Fair Employment Practices Commission. Fair Employment Practices Commission. Tap, 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 tap. And then after the war, it's going to be integration of the armed forces, which means desegregation. All right, let me double check on that, make sure it looks real good. I think it's good enough. All right, so that covers African Americans on the home front during the war. So let's go ahead and rock and roll. And now we're going to learn about something that would happen that was really, really bad during the war at home. It's called the internment of Japanese Americans in the U.S. So what internment is throwing someone in jail, essentially. And this happened, and I'm just gonna tell you what happened. I'm gonna go through the slides because you'll hear the story. I don't want to give it all away, okay? All right, so here's the deal. After the Pearl Harbor attack, the American government did something that's really, really bad. It's extremely racist. Japanese Americans, and I'm talking about Japanese American citizens, I'm not talking about Japanese illegal immigrants, because remember, in the United States in the 20s, unfortunately, or really before the 20s, we had the Gentleman's Agreement. So any person coming from Japan had to become a citizen when they came to America, and they were kind of forced to assimilate, which is not good. And it actually cuts off Japanese Americans coming to America. So the government had a racist view towards Japanese Americans before Pearl Harbor, and then after Pearl Harbor, the government does something really, really bad. What they did is they took any Japanese American living on the West Coast and they threw them in what is essentially prisons. They were mainly outdoor style prisons, and I'll show you some pictures. And there are 120,000 of these people who were thrown in jail. They get no trial, all right? They're not recognized as citizens during the war because they get no trial, so we're gonna talk about that in just a minute. But they were kept in these, what is essentially, they're very similar to the concentration camps. I'm going to show you pictures. So they make them live, they're got barbed wire fences around them, they're guarded, they live in these places. And a lot of these, what they were old horse barns and dairy barns and things like that. And the people, while they were in there, they were required to do work. They were paid just a small amount every day. I mean, like, you couldn't even live on this amount of money they were paying them. And I believe they were given food, or they may have had to buy their food. But it's essentially concentration camps in the United States for Japanese Americans. So there's kind of some irony there with the war with America going and defending freedom and all this stuff. It's really, really bad, and this should not have happened. This is a big, bad thing that FDR did, okay? Now, this is really unconstitutional that the American government did this, and here's why. The Fifth Amendment guarantees you the right that if you get arrested and you get some charges, you have the right to a trial. It's called the due process of law, that you have the right to a trial, okay? The 14th Amendment offers equal protection under the law to American citizens. This came after the Civil War, and it was extended to African Americans, but it protects any American citizen, regardless of skin color. And these Japanese Americans were citizens. Remember, I told you that earlier. So this really is extremely, extremely unconstitutional that the government did this. But here's what the government did. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and we're going to talk about this case. So pause on this case. Don't worry about what the case is right now. We're going to get there. The Supreme Court ruled that it was constitutional because during wartime, it was a special case of emergency and peril. Now, we've seen this before where the government kind of upholds weird issues like this that are definitely unconstitutional. Remember World War I, there was the guy Charles Schenck, and he printed those pamphlets, and the pamphlets said, avoid the draft, don't go to war, all that stuff. And they said, hey, this is, that's threatening speech during a war, so you can't do that. Remember, they put him in jail. And in this case, they're going to say this is a special case of emergency and peril, and so therefore they can throw these people in jail, okay? So this is really, really bad. So literally, they could bring very few belongings. They threw them on trains, and then they threw them to these camps, where they were forced to some very bad conditions. I wish I could show you some videos. I have some really good videos about this. If you're interested, email me, and I'll send you the links to the videos. It's other YouTube videos, so I can't put them on here, okay? Very interesting and very sad stuff that this happened. Now, there was a Japanese American who experienced this, who fought back. His name is Fred Koromatsu, okay? And what he does is he's captured, and he says, you know what, nope, we're not doing this. And he actually escapes, and he runs away. I can't remember how long he was able to escape. It wasn't very long, but he was eventually caught. And while he's caught, he fought in court to try to get out. They charged him all this money on these court cases. And he fought, like I said, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. That's what we were talking about a few minutes ago. And of course, the Supreme Court ruled against him. Now, after the war, people continue to fight for this guy. He kind of continues to advocate for himself and say, look, what the government did was wrong. This is unconstitutional. How could y'all do this to my people? And in 1983, it was overturned. Now, it is 40 years after the war, so that's not good. And Fred Koromatsu did have to spend his time in jail. And in the internment camps. So it's really, really, really bad that this happened, okay? This is Fred Koromatsu as a young man. There is a Fred Koromatsu Day, which is really, really awesome. It was actually January 30th, so it was just like about a week ago, roughly. And this is him. He received, I think it's like the Presidential Medal of Freedom or something like that. I don't have anything in here about it. But he did receive an award later from the government. Of course, when he's already very old, it would have been better for him to have received it then, but, at least the government did something. But so this internment thing is really, really bad in history. It's something bad that happened in America. And it's kind of a dark stain on Roosevelt's presidency, because FDR was president during this time. And remember, we talked about FDR, great president for American people at home, but not for all American people, which is not so good. It's got to be for everybody, okay? All right, so let's do this. Number one, how many Japanese Americans were detained after the attack on Pearl Harbor? 120,000. What constitutional amendments were violated? Let's see, that's going to be the 5th and 14th Amendments. So the 5th is due process of law. 14th is equal protection under the law, which just means regardless of your skin, color, gender, whatever, the government has to protect you. And then how did the Supreme Court justify their actions? They called it a time of emergency and peril, meaning they can kind of do what they want during a war, they're kind of making up rules here. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. Okay? Who was Fred Koromatsu and what were his actions? He's a Japanese-American man. Who fought the internment camps? Who fought the internment system? Let's say that. Now, I don't mean physically fought. I mean, he took them to court and said, hey, how are you doing this? How is this okay? What were his actions? We kind of already said that, but we're going to make sure to list more. Say he fought for freedom. For his people is what we'll say. Which is very, very, very good. That's awesome. All right, Fred Koromatsu, one of my favorite characters in history. And let me just make sure this looks okay. All right, it looks good. And we're doing good. We're almost done. This, like I told you, pretty simple lesson. And it's a pretty positive lesson, which is very, very good. Unfortunately, this part is really very negative, actually. But the Fred Koromatsu thing, great guy that fought for this system. And just looking at him, he just seems like he would have been a really nice guy. He's got very nice eyes, okay? Like I said, very sad that this happened. Very terrible thing that this happened, that the government did this. Hopefully it will never happen again. Yeah. All right, rock and roll. All right, so now we're going to talk about like how the war actually impacted the home front. So we talked about the different roles of different people and what happened to certain people, but now we're going to talk about like in everyday life, some of the stuff that happened. There's a lot, so let's just jump right in and do it. All right. First thing, rationing. Rationing means you're taking only what you need and nothing else. So it's different, much different than the consumerism of the 1920s, where people are buying everything and they're not thinking about stuff. This is when people are really going to have to kind of tighten up on their bank account and tighten up on the stuff that they buy, so that America can win this war. Because really, America's looking at the war and they're saying, hey, Hitler is threatening global freedom. And he really was. He really was. This isn't just the U.S., saying this time. Hitler was a bad, bad dude, and his plan was to take over the whole world, which is, I'm glad he was stopped. So America does every single thing they can to try to win this war, and it works very well. So some of the stuff that was rationed was food, obviously. You're not going to want to eat up all your food at home, and then you have nothing to send to the troops, okay? Tires and rubber and leather goods, because that can be recycled, and then it can be turned into tires for Jeeps. It can be turned into the leather goods. Your old leather can be turned into boots and things like that, okay? And also gasoline. You got to think about how much fuel it takes to run an entire Air Force. It's pretty crazy, all right? And again, with the food, people were encouraged to plant victory gardens, and we've seen some victory garden propaganda before. I think I've got some in here too. Yeah, we'll come back to this. And then people had these things called ration books. And what it was, like a book of coupons, but they're not coupons, they're rations. And when you go to the store, so it'll have something like here, I'll just kind of draw it real quick. So like it'll be for like a month. And it'll have 30 squares. I'm not going to draw 30 squares. But like one would say milk. Or one would say meat. One might say, I don't know, vegetables. Okay, and one might say fruit, and the other is just miscellaneous. So what you do is when you go to the grocery store, they would either pull this part out or put a stamp in it or punch a hole in it or something like that to show that you've used that ration and you can't buy any more for that week. Now, obviously there's going to be a black market for these ration books. People buying up rations, exchanging cash for their ration books, and then you could go get another ration book and then kind of cheat the system. But this was a government program to try to get people to help win the war. And it kind of reminds me of when COVID, the quarantine, like the shutdown really got started, and you could only buy like 2 cans at the grocery store, 2 things of milk, that sort of thing. So very, very interesting, the parallels there. So some propaganda. Remember, propaganda is it's media like art that has a purpose behind it. It has a message behind it. So first one, War Gardens for Victory, Victory Gardens, grow vitamins at your kitchen door. I think people should still do that. I live in an apartment, so I have no way to. I guess I could grow on my balcony, but it would probably not be good. So War Gardens for Victory, defense needs rubber. Like I said, people were encouraged to recycle their tires. And then it says they've got more important places to go than you as these guys head off to battle. It says save rubber, check your tires now. So very cool. All right, bond drives. So a bond drive, what this is the government sells certificates. And what they say is that, hey, you're going to pay $50 for this certificate now, and then it sits in the bank, and it belongs to you. You can cash it out at any time, but after a certain amount of time, like 25 years or more, it will be worth this much more money. And it's usually a pretty significant amount. So the government sells these certificates, and people keep them in the bank, and then later they cash them out. Somebody bought me a bond, it was like a congratulations to my mom when I was born, and it was like a $25 bond when I was born, and then I cashed it out when I was 18, and it was something like $250, which isn't that much growth over that much time, but it was basically like a free $250 to me at that point. So, because after, over time, you've pretty much forgotten about that money. So that's what happened is Americans spent billions on these bonds, and what the government did is they took that money and they supported the war. They said, hey, we're going to reinvest this money into our war machine. We're going to invest this money into our tank factories, our airplane factories, etc. Then after we win the war and our economy's still going, you'll be able to cash out this bond much later. All right. So it's a way for the government to raise money very quickly, and it works very well. Okay. So there you go. All right, propaganda. Propaganda, we've kind of talked about already, but now we get to real propaganda. Most propaganda during World War II is going to be very patriotic. However, some patriotic is going to be really, really negative and honestly really, really racist. And I'm going to show you that right now. Okay, so here's one. This is the racist one that I was talking about. It's a Japanese person, not a Japanese American, but it's a Japanese person. But you can see the features have been really exaggerated. That's considered racist propaganda right there, okay? So this is some negative propaganda right here. But you can see it's very effective because look at it. This is kind of scary right here with Hitler with a gun. This guy's got a bloody knife. Again, they've depicted him in kind of a racist way. And look, they're looking at the U.S. and they've got all our factories. And look, our homes are in danger. Our job is to keep them flying. So it's really to get people psyched up for the war and say, hey, we've got to stop this evil man. And that one is terrifying, actually. If I saw that in the middle of the night, just even hanging on the wall, I would be very uncomfortable. It's scary. All right, so there you go. All right, now, so we already talked about this a little bit with the Great Migration when we were talking about the social impact on African Americans, but we're going to revisit it. Cities are going to grow more than ever. This is when American cities really become American cities. They're growing, okay? And it's because of factory jobs. And that's something what we've talked about since the beginning of the year with the Gilded Age. Factory jobs attracted people to cities, all right? All right, now here's something interesting, and we're kind of switching gears every slide here. That's okay, it's just quick topics that we have to go over. Something called the Bracero Program. And what the Bracero Program is it invited Mexican people to come across the border. The U.S. government invited Mexican people to come across the border. And I'm emphasizing that because now it seems like our government is really much the opposite. They're inviting immigrants to come over and fill the jobs of farmers who had left and gone to war. It lasted for 22 years and it gave jobs to 5 million Mexicans in America, which is pretty cool. It seems like an effective way to get people to come and work in a good way, and I think it's very, very good. So that's the Bracero Program. There you go. All right. Conversion of factories for wartime production. So if you recall before in America, we had a massive amount of factories, especially like car factories in the north, okay? And so during the war, America realizes, look, we've got to do everything we can to win this war, okay? And so they convert basically every factory to some type of wartime factory. So whether they're producing rifle clips, whether they're producing boots and uniforms and buttons or even guns, bombs, everything, cars, jeeps, anything you can think of that involves war, American factories were putting it out. Now, this is a very, very big deal because, and I was going to mention this earlier, this is what ends the Great Depression, okay? So the Great Depression happens all throughout the 30s. And we're kind of struggling with it still towards the end, but we're kind of coming out of it because Americans are starting to slowly go back to work because of all the New Deal programs. But when this happens, America can go to work like crazy, because if you're a man, you can join the military, or you can stay home and work in a factory. If you're a woman, you're going to get out of the house and you're going to go to work. Okay, so America is going to be making lots and lots and lots of money, creating a system to win this war. So this is America fully mobilized to win the war, which is, honestly, it's pretty great. It's terrible that it had to take a war to get that much of America having success, but it's great that America did have this economic success because, and we'll see in the 1950s, it's going to create a great time of prosperity, okay? All right, now switching gears again, and this is one the state of Tennessee wants you to know. In Tennessee, actually the state of Tennessee, there were 11 POW camps, and POW camps means prisoner of war, and they held German and Italian prisoners, which is kind of crazy because they captured them over in Europe and then brought them over to Tennessee, which is kind of wild. The two famous examples that you need to know are in Crossville, which I believe is kind of up in a little bit East Tennessee, kind of upper East Tennessee, maybe around the Cumberland Plateau. Let me know if I'm wrong about that, but I think that's where it is. But then Tullahoma is between Shelbyville and Manchester. It's south of here, okay? And it's only about 45 minutes from here. And there are a few thousand German POWs here. Now, here's something not so good. I'll just tell you what happened. It's not so good. Because the German POWs were white, and this sounds really terrible of me to be talking like this, and I don't mean any weirdness, but I'm just going to explain it. Because the German POWs were white, the soldiers stationed here in the South were usually pretty nice to them. There's a lot of stories about they would actually let these POWs out during the day. The POWs would go work on local farms, and then at night they would come back and they would hang out and play music and play cards and everything like that. So during the first part of the war, the POWs are treated quite well. However, in 1945, when people figured out just how bad the Holocaust was, they looked at these POWs who were Nazis, and they said, yo, how did y'all do this? Why were we treating y'all that nicely? We didn't know about the Holocaust. And remember, the American government did a pretty good job not letting out any media of the Holocaust until 1945. And that's really when the big exposure happens. And so after all this footage comes out of the Holocaust, the German POWs, they took away a lot of their food. They didn't let them out during the day. They treated them very badly. So you can see how it kind of switches there. And really, honestly, I don't think anybody should be hated. However, I don't think these guys should have been treated nicely at the beginning of the war. I mean, they're prisoners of war. They're Nazis. We have to bring them and keep them in a place, I don't know. I don't think you can treat a Nazi nicely. All right. But history, hindsight is 2020. So there you go. So Camp Crossville, like I said, on the Cumberland Plateau, that's right. And then Camp Forest in Tullahoma, Tennessee. And Camp Forest, I think it's still there. It's not a POW camp anymore. It's like a military thing, maybe National Guard. And I know there's Arnold Air Force Base in Tullahoma as well, which is pretty cool. All right, so 31. And we're almost done, yeah. 31, what types of goods were rationed during the war? Food, gas, can't spell, gas, tires, leather, anything that can be reused and turned into something that will help a soldier, that's what they're going to do. What is the purpose of a war bond? So citizens will invest their money into the war effort. So citizens pay a certain amount of money for these things. Hang on, I'm going to add something. To be repaid later. So like I said, the government sells these pieces of paper, and it is an official piece of paper, okay? And you stick it stays in the bank, and over a certain amount of years, usually it's like 20, 25 years, maybe even 15, you can go back and it'll be worth a lot more. It gains interest. So this is citizens investing their money, and the government straight takes that money and puts it right back into the war machine. So building factories, getting stuff across to the soldiers at war, food, that sort of thing. Okay. So yeah, there you go. Bracero Program. So invited Mexican farmers. I don't know why I wrote it like that. To work on American farms. And that's the government doing that. And if we look at the history of immigration, that's very unique. All right, and where were the most famous POW camps in Tennessee? Those are going to be Crossville, Tennessee, and Tullahoma, Tennessee. So there you have it. We have covered the war on the home front. Let me make sure we don't have any more questions. I think that is it, but let me look. All right, so we got it. There's one more story I wanted to tell you that I just remembered about this. There is a story of a prisoner of war, a German prisoner of war, escaping. They were up in Appalachia, kind of like the Smoky Mountains, and a Nazi prisoner had escaped, and he went to this old woman's house, and he wasn't going to try anything, or at least they don't think he was going to try anything bad, like, steal from her or kill her or anything like that. However, the woman, it's an old lady, she was home alone, and she got scared seeing this man coming up to her doorway. She walks out the door with a shotgun and kills him. So, kind of interesting, kind of a crazy story that comes out of that. So there you go. All right, so we have covered the war on the home front. First, we started with women's roles during the war. Then we moved on to African-American roles during the war at home and the advancement and civil rights, which is very good. We're headed towards the civil rights movement. From there, we talked about the internment of Japanese Americans, which was not so good, and Fred Koromatsu, who did fight for that, for it to be unconstitutional, which is very, very good. And then we went through a bunch of stuff like rationing, the Bracero Program, and many other things. So you can go back through if you need to. I'm not going to sit here and waste your time. Guys, email me if you need anything. Visit my website to download the PowerPoint. Yeah. Hope you learned some stuff. Hope you have a great day. Bye!